My name is Herman Harry Better. I never used the name Herman, but that's my official name. My age, I will be, well, legally I will be 84 this year. Really, I actually will be 85. In Courage to Care, which I'm very involved in, and when I speak to students, I always say, the first thing I say is, good morning. And if I don't get an answer back, I'll keep repeating it until someone tells me, good afternoon. You may ask, why is it important that I say that? The reason it is important is particularly good morning, because it actually tells me I'm still alive. I was born in Poland in the mid-30s to parents, my father and my mother and my two sisters. We lived around there for about a few months, and we then moved to a city by the name of Szczecin, where we lived together. My father had a kosher butcher shop and small goods factory. My mother didn't work, but looked after us. All of that ended in 1939, when the war started. We were invaded by the Germans. My father, like many of the men in the city, moved towards the Russian front with the Polish army. My mother was left behind in Szczecin to look after my two sisters. Their names were Lola, that was my younger one, and Erna, my older sister, and myself. And first of all, we tried to run away from the German front, which was, we were living on the virtually on the border of Czechoslovakia, which means that the war hit us extremely early in the whole scheme of World War II. That changed in early '42, which we were transported from that ghetto to a ghetto by the name of Sosnowiec, which was a barbed-in ghetto. To get in and out was extremely difficult. If you didn't have permission, it was nearly impossible. To get out, you had to run across or crawl across open space under a barbed wire fence into the woods. In the ghetto, life was pretty difficult. We had crowded conditions. There was a friend of my mother's that lived with us as well. We were all crowded in one room. One day, my mother and her friend went off to work. We were instructed not to go out of our room and lock ourselves in. We heard a knock on the door, and there were people from the same house telling us that our mother gave her permission that we should come out into the street. When the three of us came into the street, we were picked up by German soldiers and taken to the railway station and placed on cattle trains to go off to Auschwitz. My mother's friend asked her boss, a Gestapo officer, when she heard what was happening, if he could do something. And he actually said, yes, let's go. And he took her to the railway station. They walked up and down the railway station along the train, calling out our name. We heard it, we came out, and they took us back to the ghetto. But my mother realized that the end was very close, and she asked her family, friends, the Skovrons, whether they would look after me for the rest of the war years. I said goodbye to my mother and my two sisters and ran across the field under the fence into the arms of the Skovrons. So I lived in their house. They had two daughters, very similar age to my sisters, so they made me feel very comfortable. but I had to hide from anybody else in the township. I went to church. They were a very religious Catholic family, and I went to church a number of times during Easter and Christmas so that people wouldn't get suspicious of me. If I would have been found out, it's just debatable as to who would have been killed first, whether they or I. And they were taking a huge risk because they would have also had the children killed. Towards the end of the war, the Russian army moved towards that part of Poland, and the German army actually moved into our township. 3 officers or 3 army personnel were allocated or billeted into our house. Fortunately, Auntie Anne, or Auntie Scovron, as I called her, was pregnant with a 3rd child, and Scovron, talking to his friend, the German commander, managed to get them out after a few days. When the war finished, there was not, we were taken by the Russians or liberated by the Russians, but we were too scared to make it known that I was there. So we waited until the official, or they waited until the official end of the war. I recognized one day a cousin of mine, which we reunited, and a couple of days later, an auntie and an uncle, but not my mother or my sisters. We presumed that they were all dead. Living with my aunties and uncles, we suddenly got news from my older sister, who was rescued by the Swedish Red Cross from Auschwitz and taken to Sweden, and then was living in Stockholm. She also made contact with an auntie and an uncle from my father's side, who were here in Australia from before the war. And we came out to Australia. I went to Sweden, met my sister, and then came to Australia in 1946. We've gone back to Poland a couple times. In 95, we decided to go back when the Iron Wall came down. The things that I was going to do in Poland, and that was to go back to the house where I was hidden, and also to go to Auschwitz, where my mother and my younger sister died. And I did both of this. When we approached the house in Milówka, where I lived, when this woman approached my wife and said, "What's going on?" She said, "Oh, we're looking for the house where the Scovrons lived." And she said, "Oh, that's a very sad story. They lived in that house where your husband is standing, but they had to run away after the war because they were accused of being cooperating with the Germans." So I met up with the 2 daughters, and one of the daughters handed me an envelope which said I was instructed by my mother not to give it to anybody except you personally. And that was a certificate which showed that they had hidden me during the war. And that should have been sufficient to have them tell to people that they were not cooperators, but actually saved somebody. Because that woman, in fact, said they kept on saying that they saved a Jewish boy, but no one believed them. To which my wife said to her, "Well, that's him."